All right, so yeah, so we have a fair amount of folks. We definitely have a quorum, and I want to be respectful of our guest time. So it's going to call the meeting to order. This is a joint meeting of the COVID-19 Response Committee, Response and Recovery Committee, and the Economic Development and Planning Committee. I'm Jesse Letterman. I'm chairman of the COVID-19 Response Committee. I'm joined by my colleague, Councilor Edwards, who is chair of the Planning and Economic Development Committee. And we're also joined by Ward 1 Councilor Perez, Ward 8 Councilor Govan, and Ward 7 Councilor Allen. And Councilor Edwards and I had convened this meeting. We're very grateful to Keith Ferry from Wayfinders and Mark Melnick from the Donahue Institute for them and their team's work on the greater Springfield housing analysis that's been done. And we had convened a meeting, I believe, last year when phase 1 of the report had been released, and we're able to discuss some of the data included in that. And actually, had caused us to go off and look at some additional legislation, which we are now putting in place that we hope will at least play a part in addressing some of what has been identified, that being through the Housing Trust Fund initiative with the SRA, certainly in the very early stages, but we hope it'll make a difference in the long run. We wanted to invite both of you gentlemen back to give us some more information about phase 2, and hopeful that we'll have a productive conversation this evening. I do want to thank both of you again. I know we had on our end some scheduling issues earlier on in the month, so thank you for your flexibility. And I do want to recognize our colleague, Councilor Hurst, has joined as well. So what I was thinking we could do is I could turn it over to both of you. Can introduce yourselves for councilors that might not know you, provide a little presentation on phase 2, and then we could just engage in a Q&A. Before I do that, I did want to invite Councilor Edwards as chair of the Economic Development Committee if there were any opening thoughts that he would like to share.
No, I just want to say thank you to our guests and to my colleagues for coming today. I really appreciate all the work that's been put into this project to this point, and I'm looking forward to listening and hopefully moving it forward. Thank you.
Great. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to Keith Ferry and Mark Melnick.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all and to be with Mark Melnick, my colleague and partner in this effort here over the last couple of years. I'm going to really, Mark is, as I always say, is a featured entertainment, but I'm going to set you up with some things to think about for a moment as you listen to this information. I recall last year when we were here, a counselor was somewhat, and this information can be overwhelming. There's a lot of detail here, but it also can be overwhelming in what it's saying about our community and the needs and the challenges that we have. That said, we all are people of agency, and you all are a particular agency and capacity. And I was really excited to hear the work that you have been doing on the Housing Trust Fund and other efforts to make the city of Springfield a thriving and equitable city. And what I ask all people when they listen to the housing study is to listen to, yes, the facts as they are now or as they were leading up to the pandemic, and often some of the data lags. I ask everyone to look toward the future. And I ask people, what's their vision for their city, their town? What agency, what capacity do you have to do anything about that in terms of creating and solving solutions for these problems that you'll hear about today, whether it be about the housing and economic challenges that we face in the city of Springfield and the region overall. And in particular, the council has great power and great capacity, and shown that in many cases and many times, and is working on things now, I know. But obviously the power of the budget, policy and zoning are key tools to realizing a vision that you could share, could advance for the city of Springfield. So I ask you to think about those things and think about the opportunity to make change. Obviously, this is a unique time coming out of the COVID pandemic, hopefully, working toward an economic recovery with a unique set of resources and capacities, and a unique learning from all of that experience as well, about how to respond to crisis, to challenge, to come together to meet needs. And as Councilor Letterman mentioned, this is the second phase of this of the Greater Springfield Housing Study. The first phase, just to remind folks, as you may recall, were housing, economic, and demographic indicators. Today, Mark will go into deeper analysis about everything from COVID-19 and housing impacts to segregation and opportunity in the region, to other issues around affordability that I think are germane to our thinking about our recovery from the pandemic and the future we all would like to see for Springfield and the greater region around it. And I would just remind folks that this is a multi-year effort, but one study really, 2 phases. And we do plan to repeat this in future years to kind of measure our progress toward addressing these issues. We're not working on a study for calendar year 2023, but I expect that we will get back together again in 24 to really look at what progress we're making. Where are we? So this, in fact, is kind of a benchmark report, if you will, and is modeled after work that Mark has done in the eastern part of the state with others on the Greater Boston Housing Study, which is an annual study funded by the Boston Foundation. So with that, I also want to recognize the Greater Springfield Housing Study Committee with representatives from across the region who gave insight and thoughts to what the study could be and feedback and in some cases data, and to our funders, who the lead funder being the Community Foundation of Western Massachusetts, who had been a partner from the very beginning in this, but many other funders from the region who helped make this possible. So with that, again, I'll turn it over to Mark Melnick from the UMass Donahue Institute to go through a presentation about what our findings were from the study and where we think things could go in terms of solutions and opportunities for having an impact on the issues that he will describe. Mark, it's all yours.
Excellent. Thanks, Keith. And thanks, counselors, for the invitation to come talk about this work. It was a fun project, and as Keith was saying, we talk about it as 2 phases, but in a lot of ways it's one giant project that there's a strong connective tissue between the work that we did in phase 1 and the work that we did in phase 2. And in phase 1, in the presentation that we shared with you guys a year ago, a lot of that work was deeply benchmarking, which was getting into the demographic, economic, and real estate trends broadly as we understood them in the Pioneer Valley. What was exciting from that process, though, was the degree to which in conversation and reaction and talking with different stakeholders, and I think it's also the timing of when the study was taking place, over the course of 2020 and into 2021, was this groundswell of heightened interest in issues of equity. And COVID, I tell the story when we want to do this presentation, is that the first kickoff meeting for phase 1 was, I believe it was March 10th of 2020. So it turned out to be the last regular meeting that I had before the shutdown occurred. And what it provided, though, was an interesting backdrop as we went forward and thinking about the important role of place and housing in the quality of life, opportunity, and upward mobility. COVID-19 really served as a great revealer of social inequality in a lot of ways, whether it was the folks who were impacted both with the disease, but also with the economic turmoil that occurred. And, so it was an interesting and exciting moment for us to do a study like this, but recognize and use the situation with COVID as a bit of a backdrop for thinking about issues in housing in general. The entire intention of the Greater Springfield Housing Report was to take a holistic view of the full suite of housing issues as they related to a region. So this was not specifically, or never was intended to be, a study on affordable housing, but rather taking a look at the issues that relate to housing in general, obviously affordability being one of them, but also where you live and its importance in access to jobs, access to high quality education for your children, and those kinds of issues. So for us, a central part of the story is the role of place and upward mobility and quality of life. The research itself kind of focuses on four broad areas. We look at in four areas that really kind of reinforce one another and kind of build upon each other. But one is on market trends, the relationship of place and opportunity, how market trends and opportunity tie into segregation. And the greater Springfield region in particular is one of the most segregated in the nation. Even as it's improved over the years, it still has the worst white Latinx segregation in the nation among the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. And black-white is 30th worst out of the 100 largest metros. And then also the role that COVID-19 has on all of this. The report is thick. It's 150 pages. And so I'm going to go through the greatest hits a little bit here real quick. But there's a lot on the cutting room floor. So with a report like this, one of the ways we decided to frame it was to have our first slide say, getting to the point. So what is the point? What are you trying to say here? So we have 5 key takeaways, but they all really fit within this broader relationship between housing affordability and opportunity. Key takeaway 1, the regional housing market is heating up and has been heating up for a while. This was frankly, one of the original genesis points for this project back with Keith's predecessor at Wayfinders, Peter Gagliardi, saying that he was hearing a lot from people in the community that the housing market was heating up, and we want to have good data to talk about these concerns about gentrification and people being priced out of markets. And the data that we have continues to confirm that this has been a heating up housing market for a while. That said, at every income level, households are experiencing what we called a housing mismatch, or a lack of homes that meet their needs, especially income to rent. There are sizable differences in access and affordability by race, and these contribute to persistent trends in segregation in the region, and that COVID-19 exacerbated these trends or exacerbated an already difficult situation. What's interesting about this, and one of the things we'll highlight in here when we talk about, well, let me advance here, and then I'll talk about some of these elements. From those key takeaways, we developed a series of what we call policy intuitions. These policy intuitions were developed through an equity lens, focused on outcomes on the production and related resources and access to opportunity across the region. We focus specifically on issues of regionally shared municipal housing production level goals. One of the biggest challenges in Massachusetts, and Springfield is no different, is that housing production has not kept up with demand. So while Massachusetts and different parts of Massachusetts had done a pretty decent job of building housing over the last decade, it still pales in comparison to previous decades and our ability to grow housing, but the demand level for housing is such that we are just not producing enough, and that lack of production puts a lot of pressure on prices. Increased household economic mobility opportunity through employment, and different elements of economic development. One of the important things, and I'll touch on this in some other places, the greater Springfield region doesn't get a lot of attention for having high cost housing, and in part because other parts of Massachusetts have really high cost housing, greater Boston, for example. But what's an important part of understanding the story of housing affordability is that there's 2 things in the equation. There's how much housing costs, and there's how much money you make. And one of the tension points that we find in the Pioneer Valley is that even though the housing is more affordable than, say, the eastern part of the state, the wages for jobs in the region are lower. And as a result, the pressure points are higher on households when it comes to affording housing. We also talk about building at many different price points to both help with the issue of production and affordability. Increased resources for renters and infrastructure. The COVID crisis unveiled really some of the important ways in which Federal, state, and local governments were able to help support renters in particular, but other households as the economic downturn occurred. And the next policy innovation we had was around garnering resident support in changing local zoning and production. We have NIMBYism issues, and obviously the housing choice legislation by the state government was an important move in helping with dealing with some of the local zoning challenges that we have, but we've seen a lot of pushback on that legislation as well. And extended sustain state and federal programs, and I mentioned a little bit before already about the successes of COVID and some the COVID programming to help keep people in their homes. So getting into the market trends, I will make a couple of comments on each of these sections, and I'll just show some of the data that I think really makes the point well in those sections. But the regional housing market is heating up. Home and rent prices rose in the region for the last several years. Pre-pandemic, vacancies were dropping, and throughout the pandemic, home prices continued to rise rapidly as the inventories were tight. Home prices continued to increase, and rents in the region actually rose during the pandemic. So in some parts of the state, Boston in particular, rents actually decreased during the pandemic and have come back up again. But in the region, in Greater Springfield, we actually saw rent prices going up. So in terms of a heating up market, this graphic here, we have it in bars and we have it in table, but you're basically looking at the same thing. What we're looking at is the median sales price for single family homes in 2019, 2020, and 2021. And I think what's important just to highlight here is the degree to which housing values have been going up in the region. Over that 3-year period for Pioneer Valley, prices have gone up 26%. And Hampden County actually saw the most dramatic increase at 30% over that time, even though the prices are a little lower in Hampden County, the prices have been going up more dramatically. This next graphic kind of touches on this again, looking at the percent change in median sales values for all owned homes. On the left, you're looking at change in prices from 2010 to 2020. And then on the right, you're looking at a more zeroed in period of time for 2019 to 2020. And I think the most important thing to highlight here is the amount of pink and red that we see in here relative to blue. So we see a lot of increases in housing prices, housing sales prices in the Pioneer Valley, and continued on acutely in the most recently available data. Now, part of telling this story has been decreased vacancies in general, and obviously it's a part of the supply and demand story. If the vacancy rates are low, then this puts pressure points on prices for consumers. This graphic here looks at rental vacancy rates in the region and for the state dating back to 2010 to today. I think the most critical and salient point here is just the pitch downward that we see with vacancy rates. And in particular, when we look at Hampden County, the vacancy rate being in 2010 around 5.6%. And then fast forward to 2019 being around 3.9%. So a significant drop in the region in terms of a rental vacancy. And then we look at home sales, it's even more acute, where home ownership vacancy rate hovers around 1% right now. Explaining again why we see such rising prices, particularly in the homeowner market. Flipping to housing needs and mismatches, households at all income levels are experiencing housing mismatch from lack of homes meeting their needs, both in terms of size, cost, and location. Pioneer Valley makes up about 15% of all of the of Massachusetts' need for affordable rental housing. So while the region makes up 10% of the rental market in the state, it accounts for 15% of the need in affordable rental housing. People of color are more heavily cost burdened in the Pioneer Valley. Renters making $35,000 or less are more cost burdened in the Pioneer Valley than the state. And the region needs about 17,000 more rental units costing $500 or less of all sizes in order to meet demand. And I just want to highlight again a point I made earlier. When we make this estimation, and I'll touch on this a little bit more, that value comes from holding the current household incomes constant. So saying, understanding what the income levels are of people who live in the region, what would be the demand for housing at $500 or less. So one might say it's awful hard to find places or build places at $500 a month or less, and that's true. So it speaks to the wage issue as well, right? And what the wages are for, particularly for lower income residents. So this next graphic here looks at a concept that I really like for this topic, and it's called housing cost burden. The housing cost burden is a pretty standard measurement used by the census and other folks who look at housing issues. But the estimate is that households that are spending 30% or more of their income on housing are housing cost burden. In the graphic on the top, what we're looking at is the difference in housing cost burden looking from 2010 to 2019 and on homes that are owned versus homes that are rented. So on the left, we have folks who have a mortgage. In the middle, we have folks who don't have a mortgage any longer, so they own their homes free and clear. And then we have the rental units on the right. I'd like to focus on the bars for just a second, because I think this is a really interesting point when we think about rental markets. In 2010, let's cast our mind back to the last economic crisis. That puts us in the Great Recession. So it's not surprising to see elevated levels of housing cost burden for folks at that time. When we fast forward to 2019, though, this is pre-pandemic, but what we're in a strong economy in Massachusetts, what we see is that for folks who own their homes, housing cost burden has gone down. But for folks who are renting, there's been no change. So it again highlights the issue of housing stability and challenges for folks who are lower income, and particularly within the renter community. And regardless, what we're talking about is over half of renters in Pioneer Valley are what would be called housing cost burdened. Now, the table below, what we look at is the share of owners and renters who are housing cost burdened. Excuse me, sorry for the advance. And what I think is important to highlight here is the degree to which renters in the region, particularly Black and Hispanic, are housing cost burdened in the Pioneer Valley. So they're already high housing cost burden for renters, high housing cost burden for communities of color, and it's even exacerbated in Pioneer Valley, where 56% of Hispanic renters are housing cost burden, 53% of Black. So just really talking about the issue of rent and race together. This next graphic, this next slide has a lot happening in it, but I think there's a couple things I'd like to take away from it. First, we have 4 different income groups that we're looking at for each county in our analysis. And I didn't say this at the top, and I should have, but we defined Pioneer Valley as Franklin, Hampden, and Hampshire County. I see Councilor Allen's hand up. I'm free to. You guys can certainly ask questions as I'm going, so go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm driving my car, so I just stopped, but been hard to follow some of it because I don't see the slides. But sure. I just have a clarification question on the term housing cost burden. Is the criteria that puts somebody in that position simply the idea that they're spending more than 30% of their household income on housing? Is that
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so then on this, I can make sure to share the final slides with Councilor Letterman or whoever makes sense for me to share it with, so you guys can distribute.
Yeah, I'd like to see them. Yeah.
A lot of work goes into making them pretty, so I want to make sure folks get to enjoy them. So on the rent, and I feel like it obviously helps with the story, because otherwise I'm just talking about a bunch of numbers. But with on this current slide that we're looking at, we have the different income levels, lowest, low, middle, and upper income by county, I think, on the left. And I think what's important here to highlight is, obviously Hampden County would have higher bars because these are counts of people, and Hampden County is the largest population wise, but you have this higher concentration of folks who fall into the lowest and low categories. By lowest, it was less than 25,000, and low between 25 and 50,000. Then we have the table on the right, which has the cost burden for renters and the percent of folks at different income levels that are housing cost burdened. And what really stands out to me here is that, of course, the percentage of folks who are housing cost burdened at the lowest income levels is really elevated, right? If you have less money, the odds of you spending more than 30% of your income on your housing would seem to go up. But what's striking is how acutely that problem is felt in the Pioneer Valley. So while folks who make less than $10,000 a year in Massachusetts, 70% of those folks are housing cost burdened. In Franklin County, that's 91%, 76% in Hampden, 75% in Hampshire. And in fact, from $35,000 and below in each one of those housing categories, housing cost burdens are actually higher in Pioneer Valley than the state. And then when you flip it, 35,000 and above, now we see that those housing cost burdens actually higher in Massachusetts. And it's interesting where, for households making 55 to 75, 42% of those in Massachusetts are housing cost burdened, but in Pioneer Valley, it's quite a bit lower. So again, kind of highlighting the challenges for particularly low income folks in this housing market.
Yeah, and Mark, I was just going to add one statistic that always jumps out to me from around cost burden. We're talking about cost burden at the 30%. Severely cost burden is when someone's paying more than 50% of their income for their housing costs. And in our region, 1 in 4 renters are paying more than 50% of their housing, their income for housing costs. So, 30%, you might say, well, that's not so bad, but 50%, 1 in 4 of our renters. And that disproportionately affects Black and Hispanic households, whose 70% of those households are renters in our region.
Thanks, Keith. This next graphic gets a little bit more at this issue of housing cost burden, but in a different way. What we do here is estimate what the housing demand should be at different income levels. So based on what the wages and household income are for different households, what if we assume those households are spending 30% of their income on housing, what's the relationship in supply? And what we're finding here is that we have a undersupply of houses that in that less than 500 a month category. By our estimate, what the region is 17,000 units short on houses paying that cost $500 a month or less. So this again it's another way of looking at housing cost burden, but looking at the relationship between household incomes and prices. Okay, next, flipping to barriers to access. And when I refer to access to opportunity, there are sizable differences in housing access and affordability by race. Opportunity, place-based qualities of life indicators are unevenly distributed across the region. Jobs and public transit options are concentrated in urban areas, but uptake in labor market is low and poverty is elevated. Suburban areas have higher labor market uptake and higher school performance scores, and the Pioneer Valley overall has pretty good measurements in terms of environmental quality. So we have a bunch of graphs that look at these indices that are developed by HUD that are part of analyses that are done for impediments to fair housing studies. But one of the things that I would highlight in here, and we have a ton of maps inside the report for folks to look at, but there's place-based versions of these maps that really look at issues like school quality, access to jobs, and then there are kind of like person-based qualities, person-based measures in the indices like labor market engagement, and we look at both of these things. And I think what's the most critical part to highlight here is, and it's a common story when we think about, it's like a map from an urban sociology textbook in a lot of ways, but the relationship between quality of life indicators in urban areas versus suburban versus rural. So when we look at the school proficiency index, the index is a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is a quote unquote good score and 0 is a poor score. These are indexed across all census tracts in the United States. What we find, for example, is that higher concentrations of better performing schools in suburban areas versus, say, the urban areas in the region. Similarly, looking at the job proximity or index, we see high concentration of jobs along the river corridor, which ties a little bit more with the urban parts and the highway access, and then the environmental, the urban areas having a lower air quality than, say, the more rural parts. But when we look at some of the more the individual based measures, the low poverty index or the labor market engagement index, we see higher concentrations of poverty in urban locations and lower labor market engagement. In terms of segregation, unequal opportunity reinforces local racial and income segregation. Greater Springfield still has a markedly elevated racial segregation despite modest decreases over time. Access and affordability concentrate Black and Latinx residents to specific areas, with price being a major contributing factor. Segregation also, has its roots in exclusionary policies and continued bias in, whether it's different parts of the Pioneer Valley or other parts of the U.S. as well. So this first slide just kind of shows the story about the racial distribution within the region. So the map on the left is the concentration of white folks by municipality. Actually, these are census tracts, and then Black in our middle map, and then Hispanic in our right. So I'm not telling you guys anything that you don't know, but the concentration of Black and Latinx in the region are almost exclusively in Springfield and Holyoke. We don't even include the Asian map. It's in the report, but the Asian population is only in Amherst. So we see this really significant elements of segregation within the region. Now, while segregation has come down in recent years, it's still elevated when compared to other places or by most statistical measures. This graphic that we're showing here, and Councillor Govan, do you want to ask your question?
You could finish your statement and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, great. Okay. So the graphic we're looking at here is what's called a dissimilarity index. Dissimilarity index estimates the percent of people who would need to move in a region for the distribution of that population to be even. So basically takes your racial makeup already as a given, but then says, okay, well, how many people need to be moved within this region in order for the racial, in order for segregation to be, or for there not to be segregation, for the distribution to be even. Analysts will say anything over 60% is high segregation. Anything between 60 and 30 is moderate segregation. So on this graphic, you can see here, while the level of segregation for Black to white segregation or Hispanic to white segregation has gone down in the region over the last 20 years, it's still over that 60% threshold. For the Hispanic to white, it's the highest in the country. And as I noted earlier, of the 100 largest metros, Black to white is the 30th highest. So it's coming down, but it is still quite significant. In the previous maps reinforce that when we look at the different concentrations. And what I love to also tie back to is like that role with opportunity, because we see the opportunity indexes from HUD highlight all these different opportunities that relate it to location, but we see the high levels of segregation about where people have access to location. So still a critical issue in the region. So I'll stop my comment there and I'll take your question.
Councillor Govan, go ahead with your question, and then after Councillor Govan's question, let's move through the presentation and we'll do the rest of the questions at the end. Councillor Govan.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I couldn't watch the presentation, but thank you for the slides. This information, as we all know, is very important. And what I'm thinking is when you were talking about the cost, the housing cost burden, I don't know or see how it's going to change if we economically keep going in the same direction, you know, where everything is going up except wages.
Mhm.
I'm hoping this is probably not a question for you, but I'm wondering how we can find a way to fix that somehow. And then my second question, I'll ask it at the same time, is how are Section 8 and the current affordable housing units taken into consideration in this report? Thank you.
Great. So the first question I think is a little harder to answer, and I think it's a bigger one about just broad economic development in general, and what I think is inclusive economic development, right? What are the ways in which, and it's the balancing act between the wages and cost of housing, right? So I think more production, but then also the attraction and growth of different economic opportunities that pay a higher wage for low and moderate income residents. In terms of Section 8, there's a few different places or other forms of affordable housing. There's a few places where that comes into play inside of here. I mean, obviously, those are part of the suite of different types of housing. So those households are ones that are counted in our housing burdened populations. So that is in there. I know that there's a few other places where we have data in the report about folks needing access to emergency rental relief and other kinds of supports as well. So yeah, they're part of the entire story of what we were looking at inside of here.
To that point, Dr. Melnick, just to clarify, because Councilor Govan's question is a good one. When you say it's taken into account, so for example, if you have you live in a unit that receives a Section 8 voucher or is a Section 8 unit in and of itself, whether you receive a voucher or not, like a mobile voucher, when you classify, if you classify that household as cost burdened, are you classifying it based on the market rent of the unit or based on their contribution to the market rate?
That's a great question. I believe it's the market rate, but I would want to circle back to my co-author, Carrie Bernstein, who and get clarification for her and follow up about how those are actually classified. I
think it's an important clarification because as we consider the sort of policy solutions moving forward, I think certainly for a long time, advocates and those involved in the various housing subsidy programs that exist in the Commonwealth have wanted to see reform in that regard and wanted to see it, change to be more accessible, to be able to provide more relief, but also, that we have to understand how that plays into this. So as we're
that's a great point.
Unit production and we're measuring it, we want to make sure we're accurately measuring what's the reality on the ground for
no, that's fair. Let me follow up with Carrie on that and I'll circle back.
Thank you.
And then the last data section gets into the pandemic impacts. COVID had exacerbated housing disparities in the region. People of color, women, people with limited educational attainment, folks with disabilities, folks in poverty. These were all populations that were much more likely to be impacted by the pandemic, both in terms of health and economically. Renters and owners both struggled to pay for housing, but renters struggled more. And eviction moratoria were very important in maintaining neighborhood stability. So just a couple key points here. This first graphic just looks at kind of the role of housing of the eviction moratoria. And what we see here is the number of eviction filings taking place in each county, the stop and eviction filings with the moratoria, and then the eviction filings going back up, and then continued concern about housing instability, especially for households and renters who may be several months behind on rent, as it were. So it's something for policymakers to continue to keep a very close eye on, is that level of instability for particularly in the renter community. And then let me just pivot back again, lastly, to our policy intuitions, which we touched on a little bit, but just on a quick recap, housing affordability is central to life chances, segregation, and different outcomes for people by income and race. Housing affordability is severe here in Pioneer Valley, and it reinforces different elements of segregation. Aid has been critical because of what things cost compared to what people can earn in Pioneer Valley. The series of policy innovations that we focused on really get in the space of thinking about building and production, as well as different resources and flexibility around that building, and then spreading economic opportunity in a variety of different ways. But in terms of actions, there are several policies that community stakeholders can work towards that can correct continuing and present day issues in the housing market and longstanding segregation trends. Those actions include generating flexibility by increasing resources at the state and federal and local levels, by building an understanding of the benefits to communities of building housing people can afford, as well as revising community bylaws for housing to promote inclusive regulations, housing growth, accessory dwelling units, density, transportation, and so on. Flexibility is needed for the state to support affordable housing more, as well as finding creative ways to support infrastructure and density, as well as public transit where it is now not available, particularly in rural areas. Also, increased resources for rent, house and apartment construction and infrastructure, both of the immediate, short, and long term could be great responses to the housing mismatch issues that we identified, particularly the major difference between incomes and prices. And then we note in here the importance of collaborative and regional responses that are needed in generating shared housing goals and foster a positive understanding of housing initiatives across the region. Regional collaborations and action can combat segregation while strengthening community fabric for all members. Overall rental housing needs to be about 18% more by our calculation than what exists now, and the majority of it would need to be at the lowest price points. Communities with low density amenities and higher prices building more naturally affordable units can change local and regional circumstances and turn around the trends while reversing community shrinkage and increasing tax bases. And then, and I mentioned at different points just the importance of seeing this not just from a housing perspective, but also one about a holistic one around economic opportunity. And in particular, enhanced inclusive economic opportunity that is a job creation and attraction, but also an issue of job training. We have a unique challenge that's presented to us in Massachusetts right now. One of the points I make often when I talk about labor market issues is that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we were talking about impending labor shortages in the economy as baby boomers retired. COVID happened, the world froze. We stopped talking about this issue. But one thing that did happen is we kept getting older as COVID was occurring. And that's part of the issue that we're seeing right now with labor shortages. So there is an incredible opportunity when we think about job training and helping upskill folks for jobs, because there's going to be needs in order to grow our economy. So there's a business case separate from a social case. And I think that ties really neatly into the housing story. So with that, let me stop the presentation. And Keith, if you want to add anything, of course.
Yeah,
please.
I was just going to say thanks, Mark. And on that point about attracting businesses to our region, which is part of the story of growth that I think we need to have in terms of growth and creating greater economic opportunity. It is a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge if we do not have enough housing supply. When I've talked to economic development leaders, they've talked about talking to businesses and who are wanting to bring jobs to our region, both bring employees, but also bring new opportunities. And they're concerned about the ability to find housing. When you look at those low vacancy rates, both for rental and for ownership housing, they're at historic lows. And we're not building nearly enough at any price point. So while there is a great need at the lower end of the market, meaning the lower end of the rents and the lower end of the home ownership opportunities, the supply issue is across the board. And there's a great analysis, and I put in the chat a link to the full study, which has even more data to look at. And one of the great things that the Donning Institute has looked at middle income earners. And when you look at middle income earners and you compare their incomes at the median income to home prices or rents, you look at places like Springfield and Holyoke being some of the more unaffordable places in the region for someone who's at the median income in those cities. So there is a big need for employers to both increase wages, to address the issue that the counselor talked about in terms of the increasing costs. We need to see increased wages from existing employers, and then we need to create more supply to both retain our population and grow it and grow more economic opportunity. Really critical issues here.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both very much. I know counselors will have some questions, so let's go into a Q&A, and we'll start with Chairman Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. President. Keith, can you just expand a little bit? One of the things concerns that, because you talked about the housing, the wages, and the lack of housing and how difficult it is to draw people. One of the big criticism that I know goes back, I started hearing over a decade ago. For example, one of the biggest employers in the area is Bay State. And it was common knowledge that as they recruited interns, they were directing those people to come work in Springfield. But when it was looking for the housing part of the housing component was to move to the suburban areas around Springfield. And one of the things is I've been chairman of the REO for 13 years, and I've been doing a lot of work around construction and access. How do we address the issue of Springfield being a stepping stone community? And what I mean by that is that you move to Springfield, you relocate to the area, you come to Springfield, even to Holyoke as a starting point. And as your salary does increase, you just end up moving to the better communities surrounding Springfield. I believe it was Russ Denver that many years ago, over a decade ago, gave me a map that showed that how many people commuted into Springfield to work, draw a salary, and then return back to the communities, and that actually supported their school system through their residential taxes. Could you just touch on that just briefly?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is the diversity of housing types that we need to create to keep people. So, we're not creating enough housing. There's some new developments that are coming on board in Springfield, as you all know, from a home ownership perspective. We've got the Gemini project coming on board, and that's going to create some. That's the biggest homeownership project in anyone's memory. But we need to create more mixed income opportunities within the city. I think there are places in the city too that are underutilized. Where we're headquartered at 1780 Main Street. I'm from New York, right? So when I see one-story buildings, I'm looking up. I see development opportunity, and so I think there's as you look at the post office and you look at all the one-story taxpayer buildings around there, they're underutilized. There's an opportunity to think about upzoning and then really creating the city you want. People talk about, yes, Springfield does not have a lot of vacant land, but it does have the vertical capability to grow and think about different housing types that can attract and retain different folks. And then if you're getting people to live at different incomes, and you're going to attract different commercial businesses that want to be there for those folks. And at the same time, though, you don't want to displace folks. So you have to create housing at different price points is key. And the other issue, of course, is going to be, as we saw there, is people are looking at schools. And so investing in education, investing in our educational institutions in the city of Springfield will be important as a complementary investment to attract and retain folks as they grow their families.
If I can add into, I think Keith hit the point I wanted to make there as well. I mean, one thing is that there's always a churn in urban areas, right? And I think one of the reasons too is because urban areas attract people for jobs, right? And so you have a lot of young people or immigrants or whatever. And so there is a certain level of churn that already exists. But I think that thinking about the other social and cultural amenities that are housing adjacent are central, right? And so school quality is an important one when we think about attraction and retention. You think, 25-year-olds or whatever, maybe they buy a home in your community or they're renting or whatever. But the things that they want and things that they're focused on are going to be different when they're 35. And so I think those kinds of investments are important when you think about what is, I think Keith used a great phrase there about the city you want, right? And I think that's hand in glove with housing.
Thank you both. A question I had as you went through this, we've had you here for phase one. We're excited to have you here for phase two. I think, it's definitely spurred some action on our part. How has the phase one and phase two report been received by other communities in the Pioneer Valley and perhaps also by, the state apparatus? Are you seeing the same type of engagement you're seeing from, for example, the Springfield City Council in other communities? Are they concerned about this?
Yeah, Mark and I did a presentation for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. I think there was, interest and reaction to the study. We've done a few other presentations, and I think that people are interested. There are some cities and towns that are taking more action. So if you go up the valley into Hampshire County, you see a town like Amherst, putting aside land, a surplus school, and buying some land to create housing, affordable housing. Full disclosure, Wayfinders won the RFP to develop that property for them. So we're creating 70 new mixed income units there, right? And so that's the town taking agency on its own, going out and buying land, using a surplus property, and then creating the opportunity to attract developers in. And then they're supporting that with their municipal housing trust as well. So to the point that you are already doing. And so you see some of that action from some cities and towns. Northampton has done that as well. Holyoke is another place where we've done a lot of development of late. And they have created a fairly supportive environment. I think that the big challenge in creating that mixed income is there are resources for low-income housing. It's when you look at housing above 60 for people above 60% of AMI, and that sort of what they call it the missing middle in housing. There aren't a lot of resources there, and so as you think about how you want to target your housing trust fund and other things, there are different cities and towns that are looking at not just the lowest income, but going up to 80% of AMI or 100% of AMI to support development in those areas as well, to create kind of workforce housing, we call it, as well as low-income housing together. And I think that's one of the things that many developers like Wayfinders and others are trying to do more in the region. But we're seeing support, but at the same time, we're seeing pushback. As a developer, we're working. We had a multi-year fight with an adjacent town to Springfield and Ludlow that fought us on a development that we're now moving forward with. We have other towns that have CPA funds for housing, and they're not giving us those funds, even though we're developing housing in their town. And they're talking about losing population and losing school enrollment, which is deadly for their school budget because they're going to have to fund that themselves. Because as you all know, it's the kids in seats that give you the money from the state. You don't have the kids in seats, but you still have the overhead and the infrastructure to support. So I think it's a real mixed bag. And I think we still have a lot of civic engagement to do around this, to be quite candid, to get people to understand this isn't about the other person. This is about all of us. This is about the future we want to see for our cities and towns. So if you want to see your city and town grow and be vibrant, if you want a place where you can grow old, but you also where your kids can find a home, where you're going to attract other talent to the region, it's everybody's issue. It's everybody's concern that we need to be involved with. So no one can turn away from this, and it's affecting all the cities and towns. No one's immune from these issues.
Councilor Govan.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. And my question, I guess, relates to, it's for the Economic Development Committee, specifically, I guess, regarding Springfield being kind of like the hub of services. we have the hospitals, we have crisis centers, we have mental health agencies, and our surrounding cities like Chicopee, Longmeadow, East Longmeadow, Agawam, South Hadley, don't necessarily have those services in their towns, but they send their residents to us, specifically the homeless shelters. No one around us has the homeless shelters the way we have homeless shelters. So I'm just hoping that throughout this study, we can take into consideration that fact and how we can, find a way to mitigate, the negative stigma associated with all of those things, right? We have to find a way to want our teachers who work here to live here, but for them to do that, they need affordable housing. Same with police officers, firemen, they need to be able to afford to live here in order for them to stay here, which of course is a residency requirement for some departments, but that's something that I think we need to be continuously thinking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Gavon. I do want to be respectful of our guest time. We are coming up on the 6 o'clock mark, but do any other councilors have any additional questions that they'd like to make of our guests? And I will make sure the staff shares all of the slides, as well as I know Keith shared the link for the report in the chat, but we'll get that link sent out again as well for folks. But any other questions, Councilor Perez, Councilor Allen, Councilor Hurst, that you'd like to pose prior to our convening or our adjourning?
Now, just a comment, Councilor Letterman. As I sit here and look at the studies, we got a lot of work ahead of ourselves. I do this on a daily living as a housing program director, and we not even tapping in the health conditions of the people that are renters. That's one of the things that is a great burden to the city of Springfield. I think there's a lot of work to do. And in order for those works to happen, we need to look at the economic development and the tax revenue that we need for the city in order to move this issue forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor Perez.
Hi, Jesse, I'm still driving, but I got one question.
Yes, sir. Councilor Allen.
Yeah, thanks. So I didn't see the slides because I've been in my car, but is there a slide in there that talks about, I understand many of the issues with income and housing being more than 30% and racial segregation, et cetera. I'm wondering, is there part of the document that talks about this is the number of these types of structures or housing that would narrow we need this many affordable, we need this many workforce, we need this. Is it quantified at all like that?
Yeah, so Mark, there's a couple of things that, one, we shared when we looked at the analysis of the demand or need for units at $500 or less, that in that graph, there's also units, rents at $1,000, $2,000. So there's an analysis of whether or not that's an analysis of affordability. In the first study as well, the Donahue Institute did an analysis. It's not combinable with the affordability issue, but they did a supply gap analysis. And we found that Donahue Institute found that there was an 11,000 unit housing supply gap in our region. So
11,000, all right.
11,000, right. And that's all, so that's the various unit types. Obviously, there's a great need on the affordable side, but as Mark said in the very beginning, this is about looking at the whole real estate context. Mark, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that Councilor Allen, it's a little bit missed when you don't see the slides, because and it's my own fault where I focused on just the part that was on the lowest income scale and not the other categories. So that's there. I think one other thing to talk about that we didn't touch on too much today is just but is related is on the housing condition. So we do some work, we do some analysis on just the age of housing in the region, which is older. And Massachusetts already has old housing stock. But that's, a little bit different than the supply gap issue, but it does address a little bit or deal a little bit with the issues of the quality of housing and where there may be other elements of gap that kick in as well.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Thank you for taking that question. I look forward to seeing the slides.
Thank you, Councilor Allen. And so I really appreciate the discussion. I appreciate the time from our guests. A couple of things that have dawned on me as we've gone through the presentation. And I think, all of us on this call currently are probably familiar and share these feelings, at least as it relates to the city of Springfield. I expect that we are going to see continued housing development in the city at all levels. And I actually predict that we may see it really boom in the next decade as a result of just growth across the state. But I think that in that context, the same individuals who are currently cost burdened are going to become even more cost burdened, because I think rents are going to continue to rise. And so I think that, we really do need a plan locally and regionally as to how to address that. Because even though I think even when we talk about high-speed rail, that's sort of been pitched as a massive opportunity for economic development, something that I've said, ever since the concept was envisioned, and don't get me wrong, it's something I support. But at the same time that you're doing that, you have to plan for the overall impact on the community. It'll be great to see new investment, but at the same time, the numbers we're seeing right now are the people that actually live here. And I think that's a conversation, I know Councilor Perez has regularly in her position, Councilor Edwards in his district, is when you hear that number of saying, for example, we need X amount of units at 500 or less, folks will say, well, we're going to be concentrating poverty. But the truth is that the poverty is already concentrated. People are already struggling to get by in our community. And if we can lower the cost burden, they will have additional funds to do other things. And at the same time, we have to focus on getting those people into a position where they can raise wages. So I see some thumbs up. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to contextualize some of this for us as we think about, what we're going to do in the future. And what I'm hopeful, Keith and Mark, that we may be able to lean on your institutions relative to some advice as we craft the direction of the Housing Trust Fund, and also perhaps some zoning policies locally, because I think Springfield is about to start encountering what you're seeing Worcester encounter right now, what the eastern part of the state has been encountering for a long time. And how do we really get to a term that Councilor Edwards taught me from his time at Harvard, which is fair housing, right? Which is that everybody at every level has access to what they need. So I'm hopeful we can lean on you for that in the future.
Absolutely.
For sure.
And if I could just add one small thing to what
I was
you were
going to say,
saying.
Mark and Keith, how about you close us out with any final thoughts?
Well, the one thing I wanted to add was just been piggybacking off of what you're saying too, is that one of the things that really strikes me inside of this is, in COVID was a big piece of this, is that what economic disruption means to low and moderate income folks. And while that's not a shocking thing to say, and it's kind of obvious, but the degree, COVID was that kind of disruption on steroids. But you stand here today and it's like, we talk about housing cost burden, but one of the things that makes families much more vulnerable is what the rest of the basket of goods cost. So if you're already housing cost burden, and let's say, for example, inflation goes crazy one year, right? Like, what does that mean for low income folks, right? And just how, and so much about household stability. So I feel like it's an evergreen challenge. It's a challenge to get your arms around. And then one of the reasons why, I loved this project so much, because it wasn't just about housing, right? It was about housing and those related issues that run a parallel with it. And so I applaud you guys for your interest in this and the things that you've already been doing. And we would love to be engaged in any ways that you thought would be useful. So, and Keith, obviously.
Yeah. And again, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm excited to see the work that the council has been doing already, thinking about creating the right landscape, whether it be from creating the Housing Trust Fund or considering zoning or other policy issues that could have an impact on the issues we talked about today. I would add one thing to that. As we know, we're not going to be able to create the housing we need without the support and engagement of our friends in Boston, and getting the right kind of resources that work for our cities and the city of Springfield in particular, is going to be important as we look at the next administration coming in, and having it. If you're creating that vision, creating the right environment. We're seeing in the eastern part of the state new policies coming up around MBTA stops and other things like that. There are already policies relative to gateway cities, but do they actually work for our gateway cities? Or do they work for those that are in the greater Boston area? And I think that is something that I'm talking with colleagues in the nonprofit and affordable housing sector about, creating policies and programs that work for us in Western Massachusetts. And so we will hope to join you in advocacy around that because our context is different. And then the eastern part of the state, we need programs and resources that work for us. And we matter. I'll tell you why we matter. As some of you know, while we are a smaller part of the state, right, the big population's east, Wayfinders operates rental assistance programs, including emergency rental assistance. We have the second highest demand in the state for emergency rental assistance in our region, second only to our peer agency in Metro Housing Boston. Over the last 2 years, over $100 million of emergency rental assistance is coming to Hampden and Hampshire County. So we have a great need. The state sees that. The state sees the need. I see it as an opportunity to keep reeling them in, to say, let's create programs and practices and policies that work for our region, that we can work on together in the city of Springfield with surrounding cities, to build the communities that we want, to create that equitable and thriving region that I think we all want. So thanks again for the opportunity.
I just want to say that, and I have to say this, it's creating the model within the model. The model of Boston doesn't fit in the model of Springfield. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
That's a great note.
Thanks, folks.
To adjourn on. Thank you all. And all action begins with reflection and conversation. So, let's keep going forward, and everybody have a great rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it. Thank you.